currently on the call not a part of the user empathy meeting?
Pardon me?
Out of curiosity, was anybody who's on the call right now not a part of the user empathy meeting on Friday?
I think I'm not in that meeting.
Okay.
Mitch, I think your microphone's really quiet, or my headset's not.
Oh yeah, sorry, I had moved the mic far away. Is that better?
Yep.
So I went through my notes. So the meeting was to sort of see how what the people who are adopting Istio feel about how Istio is going, and to ask us for the features they want. And most of the stuff seemed to be about capabilities, and I wasn't sure how this work group could address them. They seem more security and networking things. But two of the items stood out to me. And one of them were requests about how to use Istio in a company where there's more security and the roles are divided. So some users can, control circuit breakers. Others can look at the settings but not do them. We have done very little about that. I mean, we have RBAC security on a lot of stuff, but it's hard to sort of know what security you yourself have when you sit down at istioctl, and then if you're some kind of administrator, what sort of security you have given to particular users and things. So this seemed like an area where we might need help from the security working group, but we should should consider coming up with a way to sort of say who can do what. So I think the security work group is more focused on improving security, but we might have a lot to say about letting people understand what they have applied in terms of modifying the control plane itself. Who's allowed to do that? What do we think about that?
Ed, I think we have that personas document that Steve started, and I've been spending a lot of time reading through it and thinking about how to revise it in terms of not just personas but also roles.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we should probably include these in personas. Having personas with very restricted privileges, a very specific role within the mesh would be useful.
I think that makes sense, and I've heard similar things from Lynn. So we should see what we can do to maybe either improve this, get Stephen back here to talk about it some more. We have not talked about it in a month or two.
So I checked with Steve, and he said he's fine with us just running with it, modifying it as needed to get it through. It didn't sound like he expected to spend a lot of time on it this cycle. So it's one of our P0s for 1.8, and I've got my name down as responsible. So I plan on pushing that forward. I have not modified the document yet, but I have spent a good deal of time considering how we might modify it and kind of planning things out.
Should I put you down for next week to talk about what you have learned?
Yeah. It feels quick. It feels early, but at the same time, I know that we need to, the 1.8 cycle is not going to last much longer. So yes.
Yeah, and Mitch, I certainly be happy to collaborate with you on that. I guess one thing regarding persona in Steve's doc that I'm not so interested would be like Istio contributors and maintainers, because I don't think it's well worth our time to define that. It's more interested in like the customers we're serving.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the developers and maintainers are more personas that would be relevant to the test and release working. So I'll allow them to define their own if they feel that they need to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, so maybe
Um,
you can start with the initial pass. I can take a look before our meeting next Tuesday, and then we'll have you talk about it. I just want to make sure it aligns with what we see from our clients too. I think it probably will align based on what we hear on Friday. It seems that they have similar pain points and roles.
That sounds great. Thanks, Lynn. I'll make sure that you're included on any changes.
Yeah, thank you, Mitch.
the other user interface, user experience thing that came up, I think more than once, was showing and validating security. So they didn't mention Kiali, but Kiali, they were asking about sort of Kiali things, how to see where the traffic is. I don't know if anyone from Kiali is still attending these meetings. And I know Kiali have their own monthly meetings that I have not attended recently. And we probably should try to sync up that meeting or getting them here. But Kiali does a great job showing the traffic that's actually happening, but does not show what is blocked versus what just isn't being exercised. And some people at the empathy session were saying, well, we come from a background, we had a dedicated security team. Now we're on Istio. They want to see what's there. And Istio sort of doesn't show that. There's no way to show the network rules and the Istio rules sort of together. Do we have anyone from security working group here or Kiali? So has anybody been thinking about this at all? I have not, and I sometimes get confused between, what is being done with Calico and networking on the Kubernetes level, what is versus what's being done in Istio. Nothing really shows it all together. Is anyone here from a security background, or would it be better for Mitch and I to take this to the security working group and ask them to do this and beg to help?
These sound like telemetry signals. Am I?
Well, telemetry is about the traffic that's flowing. What I was hearing on the empathy session was they wanted to be sure that the traffic that wasn't happening was actually blocked. Right? Not just it's blocked because we're not using it, but it's really blocked.
Oh, I see. Sort of like locking down your cluster.
Yes, you want to have the most restricted permissions that your application still functions in, not just enough, but more so that even if some cluster goes rogue or some microservice goes rogue, it can't do anything.
I've toyed with features like this because it is a good idea to have your mesh locked down to the minimum set of permissions that you need to function. However, doing so in an automated fashion is really tricky because there are some request paths that may not be exercised over a given 5-minute period. So if you were to collect all telemetry data over 5 minutes and say those are the only paths that are going to be allowed, you might find that you've actually broken yourself in an hour or 24 hours or the worst case scenario, 3 months down the road.
You just close the midnight backup port and you're not going to know till midnight. Yeah.
No, you won't know until you need the backup.
Exactly. So I feel like at a minimum we should make an issue for this and ask the security working group to think about it. But because it's mostly a Kubernetes issue and not an Istio issue, it's hard to say. People should be solving these things with Kubernetes networking, not so much with Istio things. I mean, we do egress gateway stuff, but that's about it.
So are they complaining about Istio security enforced and not enforced and couldn't visualize in the dashboard, or are they complaining about between Kubernetes policy, like network policy, you can't you don't allow the traffic to go through and visualize that in the Istio dashboard. I'm just trying to understand, is this a service mesh specific problem or is this a generic problem for Kubernetes?
I think that this is a service mesh problem because Kubernetes solves sort of the north-south problem to a large degree. Istio is relevant there, but not as valuable. Our forte is going to be east-west, where we say, hey, like the only service that needs to talk to the checkout service is the cart service, and nothing else needs access to it because it's a sensitive service, right? That's east-west control that Istio RBAC pretty naturally has influence over. Does that make sense?
Yeah, except that some of the user, like I know of a user are talking about using network policy among namespaces before they move to Istio RBAC, right? Because today they are already using network policy and they are scoping their teams through namespaces. And that's what they're comfortable with. So when they first move to Istio, RBAC is not going to be like the first thing they look at. And they would gradually move to RBAC, but it's not going to be like day one or day two.
You're right, Lynn. Here's the notes that I took, minus the name of the company that asked for it. They had a security team that did firewall rules. Now with Istio, they don't know how to show and validate the equivalent of firewall rules. They asked what the roadmap was for a web UI that can show other teams that are not familiar with Kubernetes and Istio to see a dashboard of what is talking to what. They didn't mention Kiali here, but Kiali is a dashboard for what is talking to what. But there's, and maybe that's enough. Maybe we don't mention Kiali a lot in our documentation, and we should tell this company, well, you use Kiali to see what your microservice is doing. Tell that to your network guys, but their network guys maybe aren't familiar with command line Kubernetes either. So it's something worth thinking about. How can we make Istio more available to a security team whose only focus is on security and not on the other things that Istio provides, like telemetry and traffic management? Okay, so I just brought that up as food for thought for the group. Mitch, was there anything, or Lynn, was there anything, or John, that you saw at the empathy session that you thought that this working group should rank more important for 1.8 and 1.9?
I noticed that a lot of our users are unaware of canaries and are either not using them in production or are simply don't know that they exist and that they should be using them.
Control plane canaries or
yeah,
their own microservices?
For Istio upgrades. So that's something that we should look at both in terms of how we're communicating that to our users, how we're making sure that they do know to do that. How can we maybe discourage in-place upgrades and provide like a warning, hey, this is unsafe, use canaries instead, something like that. Along with, let's see, that's the communication. And then understanding kind of what the friction is there or what the hesitation is. I'm not entirely clear on that from the meeting that we had on Friday.
My view of this is that the next step for helping them understand that is a istioctl command to list their control planes. We had a lot of arguing about that in 1.6 and 1.7 because, of course, your control plane might be remote. But I think we agreed for 1.8 that we're going to look at the injector config map and we're going to provide commands to let people sort of see which namespaces have which injectors. And just that command that sort of says, you know, all your namespaces are injected by your master control plane should be enough because it will let them see that they could have had a canary for some namespaces.
Yeah, I think it'll be valuable and that will move the needle on experience there. I think perhaps one of the other difficulties is that when we talk about canaries, we are thinking about running n control planes, where n could be absolutely any number and you can have all sorts of complex configurations. But for 99% of our users, what they're worried about is having 2 control planes, which is a much simpler scenario. So having some 90% commands that work only for canarying a control plane. You have one that's master, you bring one in, you move traffic over to it, or all the proxies over to it, and then you shut down the old one. Those commands would not work for users that want to have 5 or 7 out there for various reasons. But I do think that that would help users transition from the in-place upgrade, which makes a very intuitive sense to our users, to this sort of more flexible. Right now, it's an infinitely flexible model, and I think that's a little bit overwhelming.
Right. So we want to recommend a best practice that sort of install a canary, move one namespace at a time to the canary, and then make the canary the new master. So we want to organize that command around that story, so we have a better story for how to do it.
No, I think that's right.
Yeah, so I think you're right. A lot of users are not so much aware of trying control plane canary. I know for IBM invited 3 users, and all of our users are looking at like a managed Istio solution. So this would not be something they would be interested to take care of, because they would trust the cloud provider to do that for them. And also because of the fact that we support in-place upgrade and canary upgrade, it's super confusing for us. When we provide the managed solution for our user, we went down to the in-place upgrade because it's a simple experience for the user, and they don't have to do switch the control plane. The other key factor, I think it's also, most of our users are not complaining about control plane update. It's actually being gone through pretty smoothly. Most of the complaint we heard is about the gateway update, where the gateway has a downtime, and our capability on Canary is only on Istio and not on the gateway. So so for our user, it's not useful for them, even if they move on to control plane canary, or even we support that in our managed solution, because that would not help them with the gateway downtime issue during the upgrade.
What I find kind of interesting is that we actually got very few complaints about ingress upgrades, and then we added a new feature, which doesn't make it any worse, and now we get a bunch of complaints. I just found that interesting. I think it's valid. Like, we should have a better way to do it, but it's interesting that we didn't get a lot of issues with it previously.
I think the statement there is that canaries are not super valuable if you're not canarying everything, right?
Yeah, I think it's valid.
I think so, especially people care more about data plane traffic. I mean, having Istio control plane canary is nice, but they are not so much worried about Istio down more than the gateway down.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, ingress is the most sensitive part of your cluster, right? It'll affect all of your traffic. If you bring one service down,
right,
you'll have east-west loss, and maybe you've got rerouting or something to handle that. But if your ingress goes down, you have an outage.
Right, exactly. That's why, you know, we started to keep hearing. I think it's also partly because a lot of the users are getting into production and they do a lot of testing themselves for upgrade, and then that's how they find out, you know, it's taking 10, 20 seconds downtime for them, even though they already have multiple replica of the ingress gateway during the upgrade.
I wonder, would it make sense to provide our users with tooling that makes it easier for them to run their own ingress gateways that would not be automatic upgraded?
Yes, we are actually working on that instruction ourselves. We'll be very happy to roll that into the Istio community as well. But the challenge is, I mean, so first of all, it relies on a support I think Martin added for the community called revision. So the Istio operator also supports revision. So the way it works is you can have one revision just to have your Istio control plane and your default gateway, and then you can have a different revision just focus on your customer gateway, and then that way you can fully control your customer gateway upgrade, well, or like our management solution will provide the control plane and default gateway update for the user.
Yeah, I think kind of the best practice is to have them split up. We've kind of, like, if we go back in time to our old Helm charts, we had this big monolith, right? And then we went to like these split out approaches. And then with istioctl, to some extent, we have a monolith again because there's a single Istio operator file that we install, right? Really, the gateway should be completely independent, and it probably shouldn't be an Istio system, right? And it's really just like a normal user application. But we've kind of, because istioctl has like this monolith approach, we've kind of gotten away from that. But I do think it's valuable to have it be split and make that more common. Maybe not the default because everyone's so used to just spinning up everything at once. But best practice certainly I think is to have them split.
That makes sense. I want to ask another question about if there's a managed Istio, will there be control planes? I know some of us are planning managed Istio without canaries, but I would think that some providers might want to have a managed plane canary where you might have two managed planes and you're choosing which namespaces get what. I think about my managed Kubernetes where I sort of apply new versions to the workers and to the API server independently. Do we think that there are cases where a cloud provider is going to be canarying, and should we, when we design these commands to show off that mapping, should we be thinking about external STOD?
Yeah, I think the canary is definitely useful. So we talk about single cluster upgrade, right? From one canary. I think for us, it will be more useful, like when we provide different solution for management service. Like we have a management service today, which we run istiod inside of a customer's cluster, and we're interested to run istiod external to customer's cluster. So when we think about transition, I think the canary makes sense, right? So based on the canary, we could potentially transfer the sidecars that are on the old istiod to external istiod. So I think canary could play a key role from transition from like simplified managed Istio to the real Istio as a service running outside of your cluster, having the control plane running out.
Good point. Anything else on control plane canaries?
Yeah, I would say that I think it is useful to have for like managed stuff, different revisions. One thing that's kind of unrelated to that comment is some of the feedback we've gotten, I don't remember if it was in that meeting or if I've just heard it from other users, is that the burden of labeling the namespaces is challenging because it flips the control from the admin to like the namespace admin. And so previously, like the Istio can be kind of transparent, just Istio system admin kind of upgrades it and everything's good to go, assuming there's no issues. But now this namespace admin has to go and update their label every time, which can be quite challenging for some setups. So what we've heard from some users, and I think like the ideal would be if you don't care about what revision you're using, you just slap on the Istio system or Istio injection enabled label, and someone will configure that in a centralized place where that goes. And if you do, because you want to be cutting edge or you want to test out a version, then you can do the istio.io/rev label to override it. But right now, like basically the idea would be to give centralized control over the revisions, essentially, rather than decentralized.
I
Makes
think that's
sense.
a great idea. I mean, similar as what we heard from our user, they want to have the admin kind of default like timeout and retry. So this would be like a global default, and unless you want to overwrite it, then you have to specify it.
Yeah, I think the original design actually, it might have had this or something similar to this, and then somehow we didn't ever implement it.
In 1.8, are we going to be able to specify any revision label, or is there still going to be that limit that we had in 1.7? The limit
I'm not
of,
sure what limit you mean.
I mean, the limit of you can't specify istio.io/rev equals for your master control plane.
Yeah, that's not fixed. I mean, we could fix it. We should probably fix it along with fixing this. I think this is an easy problem to solve with not taking into account like tooling and istioctl and Helm and all that stuff. Like, I think we just need to make a webhook that matches that label and points it to wherever you want. How we expose that to users, how we hook it into the operator, that's the only hard part. Like the actual, Kubernetes config, it's pretty trivial to do it yourself, I think.
I agree.
So I think this actually, it's very feasible to do, and we could probably even do it in 1.8. It just needs someone to dedicate some time to thinking about how all the pieces fit together.
And I agree with you that it's nice to just do the labels explicitly and not make people learn an istioctl command for label. And the analyze command sort of already gives you the kubectl command to do the labeling. So I think we're in good shape. So that was all I had to say on the empathy session. Do we have any other comments from people at the empathy session of things that we should be looking at as a group?
Yeah, so just on this point, not from the emphasis session, but we did hear from our user. Some of them were complaining to us that upgrading the data plane manually is too troublesome. So some of them even mentioned, like, if we would be willing to support, like, if they label their paths in a certain way, that we would automatically upgrade the data plane for them whenever the control plane gets updated. And then if they didn't have such a label, then they would manually do rolling upgrades of the data plane. I don't know if you guys heard something similar, but I could understand, given it still moves so fast, like between 1.6, think about how many mini releases we have. It's like 9 releases from 1.6.0 to 1.6.809. So that's a lot of data plane upgrades for a lot of users.
So Lynn, there is a work item slated for 1.8 that I don't have in front of me to provide a command to do this. It wasn't going to be based on an annotation to do it automatically as part of istioctl install. It was going to be a command where you'd say restart either a deployment, all the deployments in a namespace that had our sidecar, or all of the deployments in all namespaces with the sidecar. So there's going to be command line for that. Do you think that would be sufficient if we gave them, after they did istioctl install, it sort of said, now run istioctl data plane restart, or is that not good enough?
I think that helps, but they still have to initiate the command. If you think about the managed environment, the control plane are not upgraded by them. So like moving from fixes from 1.6.0 to 1.6.1 or 9, all are provided by the cloud provider, and then they are the one who have to manually upgrade the data plane. So even though it's one command, they still have to do it.
So yeah, that makes sense. I was thinking cloud provider would do it, but there probably does need to be a way to signal it.
Yeah, cloud provider normally don't touch the data plane because they don't know which workload is critical. And that's why I think a annotation would come helpful. Like they know these are the services that they just want to automatically upgrade it with. These are super critical. You know, they really want to upgrade it at a convenient time when they are actually working.
I think, you know, the question of upgrading the data plane, it's really one of orchestration and of continuous deployment. And I wonder if the solution here is not to provide easier ways for them to integrate data plane rollouts with their existing continuous deployment system.
Should we not, rather than upgrading their pods, have Istio control plane label the pods that are old and then provide a command for users to restart any pods that have that label? So we would do it in 2 phases.
I see the usefulness there, but I do worry that we're getting into a very complex ecosystem of continuous deployment where there are a lot of really well-established solutions. And I don't know if that's necessarily where we want best.
That probably makes sense. All right, so let's
Yeah.
think about this and figure out how we might help people with this in 1.8.
And this is something that we struggle with a lot in user experience. Istio is not a end-to-end solution for anything. It's meant to be part of an ecosystem. And so there are things that it doesn't do that our users absolutely need. That makes it really difficult to demo effectively. You know, John, I know that you ran into this with the add-on problem. Like for a demo, what I want is an install Istio command, and then poof, I've got everything that I need. I can show off all the bells and whistles and all the features. But for production, what we need is to stay in our lane effectively, to handle only service mesh relevant concepts and delegate, you know, orchestration to Kubernetes and continuous deployment to whatever their particular solution is there. I'm not sure how we balance those two needs. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think this becomes more of a problem for service mesh is because their apps are not changing, but they have to do rolling restart because of the sidecar change. I think any guidance we can provide will be really cool. You know, whether it's maybe having some type of notification system to their CI/CD pipeline so that they can trigger the restart for all the pods, you know, they just want to automatically taken care of. Oh,
We haven't
manually.
We have an analyzer for this, but it just says it's old. It doesn't say here's how to fix it by running rollout restart.
Oh, so you guys are saying maybe they just run analyzer every week or every other day, and then
I mean, it would be an improvement for analyze to say this guy needs a restart and not just this guy's sidecar image is old.
But is that something what the user really wants? Kind of a notification or just a kind of more active?
Some users want it managed for them. I want it managed for me, right? So I don't care if my app is down for 10 seconds a week. Other users want to control that in a particular window, and there needs to be some way to do that. So the idea of having an annotation that sort of says automatically do it, or warn me, or ignore this problem would be awesome.
Yeah, so maybe what we as UX ought to do is invest in a reference implementation using a CI/CD system and write a blog about it. Show like, hey, this is how you get automated data plane upgrades.
Yeah, so maybe one thing is that you allow user to label a namespace or pod level to say these are the ones I want to automatically upgrade, and then we provide a istioctl command or expand one of our existing command. All user needs to do is every day or every other day just run that command, and that would scan for pods or namespaces that has that particular annotation, and then we would just check if there's any parts that didn't match the control plane sidecar version, and then upgrade for them.
I think that's great. Let's write that up and talk about it next week. I can take a look at that.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. I think that would be helping a lot of users because they're not used to upgrade so frequently.
Yeah. Good enough. So I wanted to move on. I had a couple items, and I see Howard has added one. I just had a short question about an issue Lynn filed for us. The warnings that we give for namespace not injected for Istio injection. First, we give it a level warning, which might be too high. We warn about if you use all namespaces, we warn about namespaces that you don't want injected. So I guess the question is, what? It does seem that we're warning much too high for this. What should we? What should we be saying for all namespaces? Should the cloud provider be putting inject equals false in the ones to get rid of this message? Is it istioctl's or the analyzer's responsibility to not look at particular namespaces regardless of an annotation for that? Does anyone have any thoughts on what warning level it should be and how the user or cloud provider should control it?
So I took a look at this. I think this is this was discussed actually. This analyzer was written. One improvement actually I think we probably could have is right now we put warn and info all to standard out. So that's why like user like see this message along with like info. What we probably can do is put warn as standard error. So if they pipe standard error to like dev null, and then they won't be able to see warn, and they just see info or yeah. So that could kind of reduce the number of warning messages that they see.
Isn't it the opposite? You want to filter out the info, but the warning and errors? Like errors are the most useful, so we always want the errors. We sometimes want the warnings. We less sometimes want the info, and we never want the debugger. I mean, sometimes maybe debug. I don't even know if we have debug, but I don't see why we would want debug but not error.
Yeah, it was. I was thinking. The error here, like the issue here is like we have too much warning. So how do we want to reduce the warnings?
Well,
I would think we just bump it down to info, and then we already have a flag to get rid of info level. I think if you don't like it, like you can hide info level, I believe.
Yeah, I think there are two issues basically. So one thing is the warning. Is this really a warning? Because I look at all these namespaces, I actually have no intention for them to have Istio injection. So I don't really need that warning. So, but what's tripped me is at the end of a bunch of warning and info, there's an arrow. Analyzers found issues when analyzing all namespaces, and honestly, that's all I saw, and that's all it matters to me. And then I started to look back to every single message. I couldn't figure out where the error is. So it's like give me a false alarm, but there's actually no issue.
I agree with that. So we definitely should not say error if the highest thing is warning.
Yeah, that's right. I think I agree with that's probably a bug.
I think we have another issue here, though, and that's that we shouldn't be even warning about like cube system and istio system not being injected, right?
So
Yeah, that's
cube system,
intentional.
cube system is intentionally blocked, and you don't see it here. I had suggested 2 years ago that any namespace ending in -system should be blocked, but people said no. By people, I mean Jason Young. So it's possible we can write an ad hoc rule for certain names not matching. The problem is when you say all namespaces, people expect all namespaces. First, I want to make sure I can get an owner for this. Jason, would you like to take this one on?
Yeah, sure. You can add to me.
It should be pretty easy.
Yep.
I will just, I think the things we both agreed on were changing these levels. If you have any other good ideas, maybe just do them and we will review.
Yep. I think, yeah, changing to info, I think I'm okay with that.
Okay.
Yeah, and then correct the arrow. If there's no arrow, just don't show the arrow at the end. I think right now we show an arrow always whenever there's a warning.
I think we put error if there's anything in here, which is not good. So, and I think the reason we do that has to do with the error level we return. I think we return a thing for scripts saying it's not perfect. So we might need to adjust that as well. Okay, I think we're in good shape on that one.
Yeah, thank you, Ada. Thank you, Jason.
Yep.
I have a philosophy question. We had discussed that the XDS-based version of proxy status commands be the defaults for 1.8. And we even had one of our users who doesn't come to this meeting implement this. But I realized after that that might break our compatibility with older control planes. Do we have a philosophy on what we should do in this case? Should we attempt to use the new way first and fall back, or should we just hold off this for a version? Does anyone have any thoughts on this?
Well, so what's our policy for istioctl? I thought we only support the current version that matches the control plane.
Well, that's the only thing we must do, but it's considered a great kindness to support recent versions. So many users are going to be, having a mixture of 1.8 and 1.7 when 1.8 comes out. I think 1.7 is supposed to work with this new XDS and tokens, but in testing it, I found some weirdness. It could be how I installed. So I just, I wanted to know what people thought the best policy was. Also, does anyone know Shamshar? I've invited him to this, but he's in India, and I would love to meet him.
Yeah, I noticed he's been pretty active in different areas, like environment also. I think he works for Red Hat.
He's been reviewing PRs and contributing them, and I don't know if we can have some different time zones to get him on board or something. It seems, I don't want to make him get up at midnight just to talk to me, but it'd be great to get him more integrated with the community.
Yeah, maybe reach out to him to see if this time works for him, or if we should move this meeting a little bit earlier in the day.
I reached out to him. He said he might show up. So he hasn't for 2 weeks. So maybe reach out again. I think that's all I have. But Howard, what do you have? What's this item? Better status on virtual service.
Yeah. So this is very vague because I don't know much more beyond the vagueness. But I've been writing up a doc on kind of figuring out issues with TLS and like mismatches and stuff. And it was one of those things where I was kind of like embarrassed to write the doc because I'm like, well, like in order to figure this out, go dig into like all these obscure areas, when it seems like really I should just be able to look somewhere, maybe the status or otherwise, that says like, hey, this virtual service is not working because it has this mismatch with the gateway or that sort of thing. Like we have
Gotcha.
analyzed, but like virtual services, there's a lot of places where things can go wrong that we don't analyze.
So new for 1.8 is that analyze is going to deal with duplicate match conditions. So that is something I would love to do. For 1.8, what we wanted to do was provide some commands to help make it easier to do this by fixing authn and describe, which go out to pilot and ask things. And I think the security group was going to help us with that. I would prefer to do what you just said, which is to have analyze really do it by looking at the TLS settings. But I am afraid, first, of my inability to do it correctly, and secondly, of duplicating the logic that is already in the data plane and control plane about that. Do you think yourself or someone from come up with something that looks at Istio resources and can tell you if the TLS is correct without asking pilot live?
Right. So that's kind of what similar to what I was thinking, where we can add all these heuristic rules, but it's never going to be enough to give us good depth, right? We really need to actually modify the pilot code to emit additional information, which is then piped through to the correct place if we want to have, fully in-depth status messages. The same applies to TLS and virtual services, and I suppose other resources as well. So I don't know how we would do that, but it seems like that is the way to go. Otherwise, we're always like, we can always add something like, oh, this virtual service has like a duplicate router. I forget what your check added, which is great, but
Right.
There's 25 other ways it can go wrong too, which is.
So I totally agree. So in plan for 1.8 is this new XDS debug endpoint to tell if a host is permissive or secure or plain. I don't know if we're going to reach that goal, but we agreed to do it, or we agreed that security would do it and we would help. If we do this for 1.8, then we would have the code, and then in 1.9 we could try to move the code into an analyzer. Is that too aggressive, not aggressive enough?
Well, I think if we like something specific, like just this TLS stuff, is probably not that hard, and then we can move into analyzer if we need. But something like having the actual pilot XGS generation, where like we go through and build all the routes and stuff, actually emitting logic, like info about why it's doing what it's doing, and then correlating that back to resources, and then emitting that status. Like that's very challenging.
Right.
I don't know. I don't even know what that would look like, but I do think it would be valuable.
So I went to the networking group with my request that, currently we put into the Envoy configuration the virtual service and destination rule that created the configuration. I asked them to put it in for authn as well, and they said no, I'd had to do it myself because they're too busy. But it would be nice if, in addition, so the authn and the TLS stuff could all be both to the Envoy config and to something that the analyzer could pick up. Currently, the analyzer doesn't ask pilot any questions. It looks at its own snapshot. So this would either be breaking that convention or copying the logic to actually, within the analyzer, generate the exact same XDS and then throw it away and only save these problems that it encountered. I see no reason not to have the analyzer generate XDS for some random pod in the mesh exemplar pod and then use that to annotate. But I don't know if people consider that to be too much computation.
I think that the analyzer is supposed to be static, right? It's not per pod. So it seems if we are...
It can't be. But if any pod is this way, there's trouble. And right now the analyzer has a lot of limitations. It doesn't currently support like the workload labeling and stuff. So it's some of these problems only affect certain cases, right? So if you have a mismatch that only affects a certain pod and there's no instances of that pod, it's not really a problem.
Yeah, I mean the same issue applies to my suggestion as well. But one of the differences with what I have been thinking about is that you're talking about generating the XDS and then analyzing the XDS. A lot of the issues I've been looking at are things where I have a virtual service, but it just gets filtered out for one reason or another. So it's never actually in the XDS. And I want to know what happened to my route, where to go, why was it ignored. And so we really need to hook in like at a higher layer than the XDS itself. But it still does have a similar problem where it's kind of per proxy, because you have different gateways which may have different results, or it could be for sidecars too.
So I have a dumb question. I thought, Mitch, you had a similar feature on this that was turned as experimental before one of the releases, maybe 1.6.
Yeah. So I think what's happening in this conversation is we're not quite understanding each other. Ed, when you talk about it being via XDS, you're talking about the transport mechanism of the data, yes? That Istio communicates the debug information via XDS events?
This bullet point is about taking the old 1.5 XDS endpoint that told if a pod is TLS or not, and restoring that and putting it under Cosmos XDS events. But there was a second thing that I talked about, which is when we generate Envoy config and send it via XDS, we could generate that config, say for a synthetic pod in every namespace, and see if any weird exceptions were coming out of the code. And then we could use that to make things. So it could be as part of the regular Envoy XDS generation, we sort of look for problems and annotate CRs with the problems. And we could put that in the analyzer. So the analyzer would itself, one of the analyzers would be the pretend I'm a synthetic pod analyzer that just sort of says, if a pod was in this namespace, what would happen?
So analyzers don't generate XDS objects, right? They don't look at routes, listeners,
But they currently don't.
etc.
But we could write an analyzer for a namespace, and the implementation of that analyzer could be pretend a new pod named foo showed up in your namespace. Would you get a error trying to generate the initial XDS for that pod foo? That could be an analyzer.
I think in this case, I agree with John that we can get to the same result for our users in terms of mismatched config without dropping down into XDS level configuration. And Lynn, to your point, if we do implement that inside of an analyzer, then that will automatically get written into the status field as a part of the existing alpha level feature. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so to me, I think the less we have user looking into Envoy config, it would be ideal. Certainly, same as John, like last week, I have to spend an hour to help our user why their gateway and virtual service config doesn't work. It's not pleasant. I mean, it's at the end of the day, a lot of us have to run multiple tools to find out what might be wrong. And sometimes I even have to ask people like you and John and Ed on the Istio project, which is even embarrassing. Like I work on this project for 3 years, I still sometimes couldn't figure out what's going on. So it's just hard for our user.
Yeah, and to that end, we do have plans in 1.8 to begin work on the trace tool. And the goal of that tool is very much to answer the why question. Rather than to solve individual problems about TLS mismatches or things like that, it's asking why a certain thing is happening to traffic. We're very, very early days in the design of that. I'm trying to collect feedback from users on what would be a very helpful format for it, but I expect that we should have some sort of a launch in 1.9 of a tool where you can ask why traffic is doing what it's doing.
And I've been playing with something like that as well, as I think you know, Mitch.
Yeah.
I have this tool that sort of currently well, the dream is that it's going to work like this. It's going to take two pods, add ephemeral HTTP bin to one pod and ephemeral sleep container to the other pod, run some traffic back and forth between the two with some odds that record what really happened, so that we would say, if these two pods ever communicated, they would use TLS. The client side would make 3 attempts, but the receiving side would only hear one of the attempts because there's some retries happening and some auto MTLS, something like that. I had some difficulty writing that so far, but I think that's what I want for 1.9 and maybe sooner. A real trace route that really says what happens if these two pods start talking, that's able to inject the behavior into them using something like ephemeral containers, so we don't ever need to think about restarting them to get this information.
Yeah, I'm not confident on implementation. It sounds, there's a lot of different ways that we could approach this, and it does sound like a lot of moving parts, but as far as the goal goes, I think we're completely aligned, Ed.
Yeah. No, I started first with the implementation because I wanted to see what would be easy. But yes, a more disciplined person would start first with what it should look like rather than what's easy. But my thought was I would make something and then sort of test it and battle myself and get early feedback to give to you, Mitch.
Makes sense. Thanks, Ed.
Yeah, makes sense. I think a user are going to need both. So first of all, they're going to look at the status fields to figure out which one they need to look at. Second of all, the trace tool to show them what's the actual behavior so they can validate and figure out that's not really what they intended behavior. So that would help them figure out why it's wrong. Like some of our users have issues with like their application maybe doing timeout and retries, and then Istio also doing timeout retries, and there was like unexplained behavior. It's just harder for them to get that information from different teams because all these services may be owned by different teams.
Oh yeah,
and,
I totally agree.
Yes.
So let me reveal one of my secrets, Lynn. HTTP bin has a delay URL. You can say delay by 1 second or 10 seconds. So in this first version of the tool, it makes a request HTTP bin for like 8 different delays, and it sort of tells you which ones Istio caught because the delay of Istio timeout was shorter than the real delay. So it sort of tells you what's really happening, and it's quite easy to figure out, where Istio's timeouts are just by sort of honing in on it using Newton's method to find like where the Istio delay starts and where the user delay ends. So there's all kinds of cool things we can do once we have like a framework to play with.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we've reached the top of the hour. So next week we have 2 exciting things. Mitch has agreed to talk about personas and roles, and we have a user report from Casey Robertson. Who put this on?
I did.
Okay, so I will look forward to stuff from you. Sounds great, Mitch.
Yeah, the context for that is that Casey mentioned on Twitter that they had a great deal of difficulty related to upgrades. and that they would like to see some sort of validation on their upgrade before running it. But they were fairly vague on the details. You know, it's 140 characters or less. So I invited him to come and share the details with us so that we could understand the use case and what he would like to see.
Excellent. So everyone come back next week and see that.